Hi, everyone. We'll get started now. Thank you so much for coming to this event co-hosted by Vashti and Haymarket. My name is Fran. I'm an editor at Tribune, at Vashti and at Tribune, and a freelance writer occasionally elsewhere. Today, my Vashti colleague and I, Kendall, are going to be talking to Rebecca Vilkomerson and Alissa Wise about their new book, Solidarity is the Political Version of Love, Lessons from Anti-Zionist Jewish Organizing. For anyone who hasn't read a book or picked up the book yet, it's kind of partly a memoir about its author's time in the leadership team of Jewish Voice for Peace, and partly a guide on how other organisers can seek to build comparable strength to the strength that they built in the 10 years that they were there. It was written before October 2023, but it's obviously even more timely now, given the year-long genocidal assault by Israel that has seen 43,000 Palestinians killed, according to official numbers, and potentially many more. Before Kendall introduces herself and our guests in more detail, I just want to read one quote that I think really demonstrates how relevant this book is to the political moment we're in right now. On the topic of American Jewish liberalism, Rebecca and Alissa write that there's a fetishization of nuance, which insists upon qualifying statements in every situation that speak to all sides instead of being attentive to power, which leads to watering down or an undercutting a clear analysis or demand. This liberalism is deployed to mask a commitment to the status quo and a form of ethno-nationalism and deep-seated anti-Arab/Palestinian racism that is unwilling to give up its own privilege, even more frustrating when voiced by a Jewish American community that roots itself in values of equality. It conveys a belief in two equal sides in the conflict when it is clear that the actual power imbalance is extreme. I'll pass over to Kendall now, and she can introduce the authors.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Kendall Gardner. I'm an editor here at Vashti. I'm also a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford, where I study political theory, and I'm an active member of Oxford Action for Palestine, where I was one of the student organizers in the encampment movement. So really timely and excited to talk with two founders and, previous directors of an organizing group that's had such a big impact on all of us in this movement. I'm really excited to introduce Rebecca Vilkomerson and Rabbi Alissa Wise here to talk about their new book, which is such an important read. First, Rebecca has worked in social justice movement building for several decades as an organizer, fundraiser, organizational development consultant, and strategist. From 2009 to 2019, she was the executive director of Jewish Voice for Peace. In 2022, the Solidarity Network published her report, Funding Freedom, Building Support for the Palestinian Freedom Movement and Philanthropy. She is currently the co-director of the Funding Freedom Project. Thank you so much for being here, Rebecca. And Rabbi Alissa Wise is an organizational consultant, community organizer, educator, and ritual leader with over 2 decades of movement building experience. Rabbi Wise co-founded the JVP Rabbinical Council in 2010. From 2011 to 2021 was organizing co-director, deputy director, and interim co-executive director of JVP. She is currently the lead organizer of Rabbis for Ceasefire, which she founded in October 2023. Before Fran and I jump into our initial questions, just a bit of housekeeping for everyone here. We have saved the last 15 minutes or so for questions from you all. And if you have any questions that you'd like to ask Rebecca and Alissa throughout the event, please just pop them in the chat and we'll do our best to get through as many of them as we can. So I'm sure this conversation will be really generative for all of us. And now on to our first question, which is coming from me. So I really loved how every chapter of the book ends with a set of questions for reflection. To me, these questions seemed specifically oriented towards organizers. I certainly found myself trying to answer them through the lens of my own experiences in student organizing. And this left me wondering, who was your target audience while writing this book? Who did you initially imagine could benefit from the experiences of JBP? And has that changed at all since writing it?
Well, I love that question and super happy to be here. Thank you guys both so much, and for everyone at Vashti for hosting us for this conversation. We're really thrilled to get to talk to you and to everyone who's online, and thrilled to get that question because you really hit the nail on the head in the sense that we really wrote this book for organizers, I would say, more than anything. And part of that was just feeling like there aren't that many books for organizers that like speak to the experience of organizing, what it feels like how it works day to day. Like people see the sort of stuff, the iceberg above the water, where you see the big actions and the big demonstrations and the outcomes, but you often don't get a glimpse into how hard the work is and the ebb and flow of it and all that sort of thing. And so we really wanted to take our organizing experience and make it into something that was accessible and useful for people. And as I think you mentioned in the introduction, we finished writing this book in September of 2023. So we did not imagine the year that followed, nor did anyone, of course. And I think, we were hoping even then that the lessons of the book would be useful and relevant. And I think that having gone through the last year, they feel, I hope, even more useful and relevant than they would have been otherwise, just in terms of thinking about the sustainability of movement work, whether it's a time like now when Palestine is getting an enormous amount of attention, or at the times when it starts getting a little bit less attention, there's other really important work to do. One thing we talk about in the book that you might remember is like the both and, which means like sort of like holding two ideas at once and trying to balance them out. And so we've been really thinking since the book came out, it's hard to talk about long-term sustainable organizing in the middle of a genocide when there's so much urgency happening and you just are thinking about the day-to-day and what all the things you need to do in the immediate term to make it stop. But we also are really aware that there's tons of new people who have come into the movement. There are tons of new people who are newly politicized there, and we want people to be prepared and to have all the tools they need to be able to be in this work for the long haul. So it feels really important, not just to do the urgent work, but to think about building long-term organizers and organizations. And I think, the other piece of it is that we've really wanted the book, of course, the book is for the Palestine Solidarity Movement, and in particular for the Jewish wing of the Palestinian Solidarity Movement, which we've been a part of. But we were also thinking about other comrades and friends and organizations and people and movements we've worked with over time. And there's a very particular kind of organizing that's when you're trying to organize your own community to move away from the status quo. So like a couple of the other groups and organizations that we were thinking about during this, like Alissa did some work with Hindus for Human Rights, which works against Hindutva among Hindu people. And they very specifically modeled themselves on JVP. So that's another example. And I'm on the board of a US organization called Surge, Showing Up for Racial Justice, which is trying to move white working class and poor people in particular away from fascism and towards multiracial democracy. So, and we've been trying as we do events for the book to really have cross-movement panels so that it's not just that this is relevant to our movement, but to a whole range of movements.
Thank you for that, Rebecca. I think it was really interesting, to see that kind of glimpse behind the curtain. We've all seen the footage and the images of these amazing big movements big actions that JVP have done over the last year or so, but that was what was really special about the book, being able to see the kind of hard graft that goes into that. On the topic of the kind of and/or stuff, you're obviously very conscious of the contradictions and the challenges of being a loud Jewish voice on this issue, and the book deals quite comprehensively with the importance of taking steps to really center the Palestinian experience in a campaign that is fundamentally about Palestinian lives. You also mentioned one of JVP's goals being liberating Judaism from Zionism. And some have been kind of critical of that argument over the last year, that supporting Palestine is also about kind of saving the soul of Judaism, because in their view, it distracts from the focus. So I was wondering how you kind of balance those multiple focuses.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And hi, everyone. Glad to be here with you. And I feel like that argument, right, about this idea that supporting Palestine is like the critique around supporting Palestine about saving the soul of Judaism. I feel like that is kind of old. When I came into the movement about 2 decades ago, I was hearing some of those which was during the start of the Second Intifada. I was hearing some of that same critique, right? And I think that's kind of been part of the movement ongoingly. And so I have had many years to reflect on it and to consider that. And I think it's a really important point. And, it is essential, right? And as you say, we do talk about the steps that we took inside of JVP, right, to center the Palestinian experience and the times when we kind of learned from our own mistakes in dealing with kind of putting our voices forward too much and leaning to learn to take a step back. You know, but I will say, kind of take a bigger view of the question, that as an organizer, I really understand that self-interest is a really powerful motivating force in organizing, right? And I think it's okay and actually good, right? That we acknowledge that we who are not, right, the targets of the oppression that we're allied to fight actually have something to gain, right, from the fight, right? So for us, it's acknowledging as Jews that we have something to gain from Palestinian liberation. The same is true that I could say as a white person in the US from Black people, liberation for Black people, right? That first of all, I don't want to live in a world, right, that treats Palestinians the way Palestinians are being treated, or Black people the way Black people are treated. But I think there's also something deeper, right, in the self-interest when we understand at a deeper level that our movements are intersecting, right? And our pursuit of freedom and liberation, right, liberates all of us, right? And, you know, saving the soul of Judaism is not the focus of the work, nor should it be, honestly. But there is value in contradicting the idea that Judaism is synonymous with Zionism, right? Because we know that this idea that Judaism and Zionism are one, right, is a core strategy that is used to defend Israel's actions and to justify the need for Israel from the very beginning of Israel. That has been true. So undermining the equation of Judaism and Zionism actually supports the movement for Palestinian rights. And I think we see that most explicitly in the weaponization of anti-Semitism, right? That's a key way that the movement is challenged, right? It's a cudgel that's used to shut down critique and accountability for Israel, right? Are these charges of anti-Semitism. And that stems from the successful kind of intertwining of the ideas of Judaism and Zionism, right? But I think there's a strategic value, right, in this liberating Judaism from Zionism. It's not just about our own Jewish experience of being able to have access to Jewish life and Jewish ritual and Jewish community absent Zionism. It's actually it's strategic for the movement, right? That separation is complete. Because I think as long as that continues, it gives credence, right, to this charge of anti-Semitism, and that's kind of how it's used. It's also strategic because separating Judaism from Zionism is part of what we need to do in order to move, and I'm speaking here now as a US-based Jew, right? Moving American Jews away from support for Israel, right? Since roughly 1967 here in the US, kind of Jewish identity has really come to be wrapped up almost entirely in Zionism, right? To the detriment primarily of Palestinian communities. Like, we see the political impact of that. And if we're going to be successful in organizing American Jews to refuse, right, the US blank check for Israel, to be on the side of Palestinian liberation, we need to also ensure that there's a way for Jews to continue to live Jewish lives, right, outside of Zionism, right? Because right now those things are intertwined. And if we want to be able to have a robust movement, and this is something we talk about in the first chapter of the book on building political home, having spaces for people to connect with our culture and our tradition, right, is actually really essential to creating durable movements where people stick in it for the long haul, because unfortunately this is a long haul fight, right? And so there do need to be ways for people to live and express their Jewishness outside of Zionism. So that's also strategically necessary.
If you don't mind, I just add one thing, which is that we've been on tour and doing events around the country. And one thing we've really noticed is that especially on campuses maybe, but young Jewish activists and I think all Jewish people who are involved in the fight against the genocide are in a lot of pain. about the ruptures that are happening in Jewish community, like really in a lot of pain. And that obviously doesn't need to be the concern of the broader movement. But, we're talking about people who are like in the encampments, who are like doing the work. You know what I mean? They're not like talking about what's happening in Jewish community to the exclusion of what's happening to Palestinians at all. But there is like this byproduct of this incredible pain because of the rupture and sense of betrayal, given the Jewish communal institutions and the way that they're supporting the genocide. And so, I think, again, to go back to this thing about self-interest, like we're Jewish people who care about, you know what I mean? Who care about the future of Jewish life, and also that Jewish life be something that like reflects our own values. And so, I don't want to speak for Alissa, but you're a rabbi, and and from all of our conversations over the years, I know that this is true, that it is important to us. You know what I mean? It's certainly not the most important thing, but it's an important thing.
That's a great segue to the next question, which is directly about chapter 1, which I thought, was just so interesting for so many reasons. And again, just kind of like speaking from a movement context and from like the encampments, it was so important that we built spaces that were like safe and welcoming, but there was a lot of tension there. And I think that always exists in movements. So on to the question, which really gets to the heart of that. So chapter 1 of the book explains the importance of building a political home to JVP's organizing strategy. By making a place where people live, learn, love, celebrate, and grieve together, you create a movement that people can come back to and sustain. In the feminist organizing tradition, the idea of a political home is a very fraught one. In particular, Bernice Johnson Reagan, a Black feminist theorist and organizer, is very clear that a political coalition is the antithesis of a home, and that political work should be uncomfortable and dangerous, particularly because seeking comfort led the feminist movement to exclusionary and racist practices. She says, quote, "Some people will come to a coalition and they rate the success of the coalition on whether or not they feel good when they get there. They're not looking for a coalition, they're looking for a home." So, what does it mean for JVP to build a political home, especially as a predominantly white and Ashkenazi movement in a Palestinian organizing space?
Yeah, I really love this question. I'm like very grateful for the sort of gentle call in about it, and the opportunity to be able to have like some precision about it. And I do want to start out by saying that I think a coalition is different than a political home, and that it's true. Like I agree with that quote in terms of coalition building, but people still do need a home base, where you can sort of like figure things out and let your hair down. And I think we all know that like a huge part of organizing is political education, and you do political education because you don't know everything and you can't show up knowing everything. Nobody does. People start from where they are. So you need a space to explore. You also will also be uncomfortable because you're doing things and exploring ideas that you haven't heard before. But, you could do it in a space where you feel welcomed, where you're seen for your full self and all that sort of thing. So I think offering that kind of home actually allows you to come to coalitions as your best self. Like if you just throw someone into a coalition without them having done all that other work in places where they can ask the dumb questions or figure things out, or feel like they can get their cup filled up, then you're not going to show up in coalition too great either. And that's not going to make the coalition be successful. So it's sort of what having that sense of political home is really what allows you to take risks because you have a community that holds you. So that, so I think those two ideas aren't in opposition to one another. And I also wanted to really make sure that we distinguish between the importance of that discomfort when you're pushing the boundaries of your larger community and fighting for unpopular positions. That's important. I think I know, I think I can speak for just about anyone who's ever been in JVP or a Jewish person doing this work, that it's very uncomfortable at times. But that fact that you're fighting for unpopular positions or doing hard work doesn't mean that you can't feel comfort or safety or love or joy or fun. You know what I mean? I think this, the idea that you're only suffering in your activism or in your organizing is actually not good. You know what I mean? People need to feel like that they get things from it. Like Alissa was saying about self-interest, it's sustainable, essential for the sustainability of any movement to be able to get some of those things too. And so that's important. And then just to complicate that a little bit, there's also a lot of truth to what you're saying. And we actually talk in the book about the ways that political home of JVP was really built around your white and Ashkenazi conception of home. And it was built to a large extent because so many of us felt excluded for various reasons, or we were either pushed out or pulled ourselves out of sort of normative Jewish community institutions. And, oh, I see I'm for you guys to hear me, okay?
We can hear you.
Okay, okay, great. Yeah, so like, though we had already been excluded from Jewish institutions, and so we created this sense of home for people, which is so important, but that also ended up in some ways could feel exclusionary for Jews of color or Mizrahi or Sephardi Jews or other people for whom that wasn't their sort of like home culture. And so there's a whole chapter in the book that sort of talks about racial justice within JVP and the ways that we fucked up, if I can say that on this podcast, the ways that like things didn't go well and we made mistakes because we had a lot of blind spots and we had, and we had ways that we didn't see things and we made mistakes along the way. And we did a lot of them. And it's obviously when you're working on racial justice at any time, it's often 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And so it's not that we like then solved it. It's still a work in progress, like it is in any community. But that is a really, really important thing that you sort of have to balance with political home is like, how is that home defined? Does it exclude people? How does it include people? All that sort of thing. And then the other thing that's just sort of interesting, I think, about political home is that it leads to a lot of emotional intensity in the sense that people are bringing all the baggage that they had from their home Jewish communities, and they brought them to JVP, which meant that sometimes it was very confusing about why people were reacting so strongly to ideas we had. And usually it was because they had already had some experience in Jewish community in other ways. Like the story that we often tell, and I think we tell in the book, is about Alissa establishing the Rabbinical Council pretty early on when I was executive director. And it seemed to me like such a no-brainer for us to do that. Like it seemed like it would be good for rabbis to have a place to come and talk to each other. It would be good for the members of JVP to have rabbis to talk to. It would be good for the world to see rabbis who dissented. Like it seemed like so easy to me. And there was like a real pushback from the membership about, not wanting to submit to rabbinical authority, which, is just sort of like it was like, oh, well, if you're worried about rabbinical authority, you've clearly had some experience with it that makes you push back against it. So there's just people brought all their baggage to JVP, and that does make it like an intense place, but also a place where you can figure a lot of things out. So I guess, it's just important to think about who's setting it. I continue to think that political home is a very important thing, but just thinking about being very thorough and thoughtful about the way you're like setting the culture of who it includes, who it excludes, what it looks and feels like. But I don't think that means that you should like throw the concept itself out.
Yeah, I find that really interesting. And the fact that the home building around Jewish tradition was so contested a lot of the time in JVP is really fascinating. I think speaks to not a uniquely, but a very Jewish experience in terms of those traditions being contested anyway, even outside of political spaces, And on that note, I kind of wanted to ask, the Jewish position here is quite a unique one in the case of JVP. In the conclusion, you mentioned examples of other activists who were organizing kind of both within and against their own cultural groups, specifically white civil rights activists. But it's also true that, JVP takes a pride in and centers its Jewishness in a way that we'd be quite surprised to see white anti-racist organizers do with their whiteness, for example. So I'm wondering if that for you makes a difference to how applicable the lessons are from this book for organizers outside of the Jewish, Jewish anti-Zionist category.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And, Rebecca was speaking before about some of the groups that we had in mind when we were writing this, right? And so the Hindus for Human Rights, right, who were inspired by our model to work challenging their own communities' support for Hindu nationalism, or the Showing Up for Racial Justice group. So I think, there are other organizers and organizing formations that are kind of in a similar kind of stance as we are as Jewish anti-Zionists. But I think, to go a layer deeper as far as the question around how what it would look like, right, if white anti-racist organizers would do with their whiteness what we're doing with our Jewishness. And I think there's a few things to say about that. I mean, I think it's important to draw a distinction, right, between whiteness as a contrived racial category and Jewishness and Judaism, right, which is a rich religious and cultural civilization, right? So it's hard to draw a complete parallel between the two, right? They're kind of apples and oranges in my mind, right? So there is a difference, right, between kind of celebrating your whiteness and celebrating your Jewishness, right? They're kind of, it's hard to put them exactly parallel. And at the same time, right, I think that it actually is really important for all organizers, no matter where your starting point is, to really will rely on the cultural traditions that you come from to enrich your organizing, right? And this includes white anti-racist organizers, right? So for us at JVP, and even beyond JVP, just me as like a Jewish organizer, right? Like I pull from Jewish lineages, right? Like that, both lineages that I think like affirm and support my worldview and my hope for the future of Jewish life. But I also reckon with my own Jewish ancestors, my own Jewish family that were part of the Zionist project from early on, right? I have to hold both those things at the same time, right? That in our own histories, we have models of organizers that kind of resonate for us today and those that really are hard to reconcile, right? And we're holding both of those together. That's part of the both and, right? Rebecca was speaking to earlier. And so right now, like in the US, where last week white supremacy scored a huge political victory, right? Here in the US, it feels really important that white people be visible, right? In showing that the white people who are allied with the vision of a multiracial democracy, that they are really visible and powerful to show other white people that there's other ways of relating to and being in whiteness, right? There's it demonstrates possible futures, right? And white people actually have lineages to draw on, both that they must politically reckon with, but also those that could be inspirational. There are a long line of white anti-racist organizers who from kind of the early days of the, Atlantic slave trade stood against their communities and understood the ethical and moral abomination of slavery, for example. And those people can be sources of inspiration, right? There's a famous book by a writer, Mab Seagrass, like Memoirs of a Race Trader, right? So being a race trader is part of the legacy of whiteness, right? And so I think that there actually are some parallels to draw of the lessons of how do we, in Judaism, we have this concept of Lador Vador, generation to generation, right? And so part of what that means for me as an organizer is that I am obligated to wrestle with how our people kind of dealt with the same questions that we're coming to face, right? And how people have dealt with them in previous generations and how we want to deal with them now. And I think that white people have that same obligation, right? When you're like whatever identity group that you're a part of that is being used to justify violence and oppression and domination, right? You have a kind of like an obligation and that invitation, right? To spin your ancestors' mistakes into blessings and to learn from the courage of those that forged a path for liberation.
Wow, that was really powerful, Alissa. Thank you. Kind of drawing on this idea of the global lineages that have inspired JVP. There are a lot of things about JVP that are specifically American, specifically Jewish, and so I'm going to try to broaden our lens a little bit to talk about the UK, where a lot of our audience members might be calling in from. So, throughout the book, you reference other groups on the global Jewish left that inspired and influenced JVP, such as, of course, the Bund. However, the book does maintain a focus on the American organizing context. Of course, here at Vashti, we're operating in a very different terrain. Although we've seen an uptick of British anti-Zionism in recent years, it's fair to say that the UK does not have a movement quite equivalent to JVP, especially when considering JVP's congressional lobbying arm, its sheer membership numbers, and its bold radical politics. Why do you think this is the case?
I feel like we should ask you guys that. Why do you think it's the case?
No one wants to hear from me.
I mean, it's hard for us to answer because we don't know the UK organizing as well. And we also don't, I will also say that we don't necessarily know the UK organizing tradition. Like, I think part of, you know, when Alissa was just talking about lineages, we had a lot of, in the US, there's, you know, endless things to criticize. But one thing you can also say is there's also been like so many really, really powerful movements of, you know, across so many issues to build people to push back against whatever policy, you know, whatever policy or movement there's, you know, or you know, status quo that there's been. And so that we have a lot of that to build on. And I don't know if that same tradition, you know, I just don't know enough about the UK to know if there's that same tradition. My sense is also, and you guys should say if I'm right or not, like there's a lot of small, you know, stubborn in the best way Jewish organizing in the UK that I know of. And I know there's a bunch of Jewish groups doing really good work. My understanding is that the Jewish community is much smaller in the UK than in the US and is much less, yeah, just smaller numerically and percentage wise. And so it's possible that the Jewish community feels in some ways maybe like less, I don't know if established is the right word, but less rooted in the UK, more sort of like more under threat, which then makes it that much harder to push back against it. And then I think, yeah, and I think that the organizing also just builds on itself. Like JVP, when it started, when I joined JVP as a staff person, I was the fourth employee. And I think one thing that Alissa and I thought about a lot when we were first starting the book was like the ways that JVP sort of both mirrored and anticipated flows in the larger left. Like JVP was founded at a time when the left in the United States was at a very low ebb. And I think we've seen in the amount of time that we've been with JVP where the left has, I mean, now this week it's harder to say that, but, you know, a sense that the left has grown stronger, more intersectional, has better cross-movement solidarity, and has a stronger politics than it had for certainly the previous parts of my lifetime. And so that JVP and it both sort of like helped that flow of being one part of what helped the left burgeon, but also was a reaction to the left growing. And like, you know, we saw that a lot in the ways that JVP at different times, we sort of had different generations of activists coming in. So the first generation was like older leftists who had worked on Central American solidarity or the anti-apartheid movement. And then later we had people who really came in specifically because, you know, after like maybe the 2009 war, or the 2014, the attacks on Gaza, people came in specifically as Jews looking to be active on this issue, but didn't necessarily have the political education about the broader left. And part of what we did inside of JVP was bring them into a broader left viewpoint. And then I would say after 2016, when Trump was elected the first time, when the movement for Black Lives had started, people were much more coming to Palestine as part of their broader leftist obligations. You know what I mean? So like, so even within the relatively short amount of time we've been doing this work, there's been different sort of like mini generations that are very much reflective of the broader political currents.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I want to ask a bit about the other side of things, the more difficult side of things. You write in quite a lot of detail about the attacks that you and the broader pro-Palestine movement faced and do face, ranging from kind of abusive phone calls to lawfare and even to quite sophisticated attempts at entrapment in one case. One of the most effective attack lines that Jewish anti-Zionists face right now in Britain, and I think it's particularly effective because, as you say, the Jewish community is so small and anti-Zionists as a segment of that Jewish community are so small, is, you know, one of the simplest attack lines is that we're just a vocal minority and not representative of most Jews. And as we've discussed, you know, Jewish positions on Israel are very different in the US and Britain, but I'm sure you face that line a lot as well. And I'm wondering how you respond to it.
Yeah, I feel like that's actually one of the easier lines to counter because really, like, every single social movement against slavery, against Nazism, you know, for civil rights, you know, it usually, I think maybe always begins with a minority, and usually a pretty tiny and vilified minority. Like Alissa just mentioned, Memoirs of a Race Traitor by Maxine Chester, which is about whiteness and how to rebel against that. So I think the size of the dissent is not at all like a predicator or judge of the validity of a cause. So I think that's, you know, and it's a very clear bad faith way to delegitimize, but it's not, doesn't really have any moral or ethical or even logical weight, I don't think. And, you know, I think it's interesting. I'm not, again, not sure how it is in the UK, but certainly in the US, the sort of larger, what we call legacy institutions or mainstream institutions, they claim to represent the Jewish community in quotes, but, you know, nobody elected them. Nobody, like, they claim that for themselves. And the idea that they are representative is just because they say so over and over and over again. And I think that's like really important to keep in mind. That's not like somebody else has the lock on Jewish communal opinion. And then all that being said, I think it's also really important to say that actually the numbers of people in the US, Jewish people in the United States who are like for ceasefire or say they're against the genocide, or even who identify as anti-Zionists are really growing. So I think like about 50% of US Jews now support a permanent ceasefire. And there was this very interesting poll in 2022 where they defined what Zionism is, and they defined it as the belief in privileging Jewish rights over non-Jewish rights in Israel, which is what one thing that Zionism is. And 69% of American Jews said they were probably or definitely not Zionist. So, you know, I think the word Zionism is a very fraught word. Different people have different definitions, but that is certainly inherent in Zionism. And so I think, you know, there's a lot of reliance on the idea that people are Zionists because they were told they were Zionists from their childhood in their education, just sort of rotely. But if they actually know what it means, they may not actually consider that they are. And I think like another data point there is just that JVP is an anti-Zionist organization and has been officially since 2019. And the last time I looked at the numbers, I'm sure they've gone up because it was a few months ago. The last time I looked at the numbers, there were 26,000 dues-paying members. And I don't know that there's that many dues-paying members of any Zionist Jewish organization in the US, honestly. You know what I mean? So I think that like, so there's both this sort of like moral, ethical, logical case against the idea that that's a legitimate argument. And there's also just the case of like, it may not even be that true.
Before I, again, gracefully segue off of that to the next question, it's like you guys have read our minds. I will say that, you know, the audience, please feel free to send some questions into the chat. I'm sure this has been really generative. I know that I have new questions than the ones that I initially started with, so please feel free to ask them. Okay, now to segue. So going right off of that idea of, you know, the like definitions of how we consider ourselves as Jews, of anti-Zionist and Zionist. I know that I'm definitely not alone in kind of struggling a lot with how to relate to the rest of the Jewish community, especially since the genocide began. And so I wanted to ask a question more on that line. So a large part of the historic JVP organizing strategy, as you describe in the book, was to operate with a big tent, in quotes, and ensure that there was no litmus test for membership, either in expressions of Judaism or in positions on Zionism. Part of JVP's focus on building power comes from building numbers, which necessitates an engagement with people on their journey away from Zionism and towards supporting Palestinian liberation. For many anti-Zionist Jews, it has become increasingly difficult, if not impossible, to meet people where they are, even if that used to be an important organizing strategy. How do you see the role of JVP in pushing forward the politics of the broader Jewish community, and how have you had to adapt your strategies on this front over the past year?
Well, I can speak more powerfully to the latter part, right, of how I've had to adapt my strategies. You know, I want to say that I still feel, and I know this is something that Rebecca and I have been asked and talked about and kind of been challenged by as we've been going around with our book and having conversations with audiences of like, we know as organizers that there really is, we understand that nobody is like born inherent with like perfect politics and analysis and skills like to join a movement and come out fully formed, right? all of us were formed, right? All of us got education and were challenged and supported to change our, to change our beliefs in some cases, or reinforce and refine them and build certain skills. Like, even if you were born into a red diaper anti-Zionist family, you still had stuff to learn in order to show up in the movement of today, right? And so we understand as organizers that there needs to be that work, right? To support people to be from where they are to be where we want and need them to be for the future that is worthy, right, of coming generations, right? And there's actually no skipping the steps in that, right? That has to be done. So the question is, like, are you the right person to do that, right? And right, I think in any healthy organizing group and any movement, there's different roles for people to play, right? And that there's some who, don't have the patience or the wherewithal to kind of do that work with people who are kind of newer to the movement or just kind of changing their thinking or like needing to be challenged, right? And then there's some people who, are really comfortable, for example, lobbying elected officials, and some people who would never want to do that in a million years. And there's other people who are really well positioned to take all of the energy, right? And this is something that we've seen in spades over the past year, and bring that movement energy and harness it into like really impactful, powerful street actions and mobilize people who are already very politically aligned. And I think in a healthy movement, you have people working all across the spectrum, right? And different ways for people to plug in no matter where they are. And we need to be doing that if we're serious, right, about building power and shifting conditions on the ground. So for me, I feel like in this year was interesting for me personally, because I, a few weeks after October 7th last year, it became clear to me that there was a need for rabbis to speak out and to remind Jewish people that the core values of our tradition push us to call for a ceasefire, right? We are a tradition that understands that all human life is sacred and that we pursue life, right? And that leads us to our call for ceasefire. And when I did that, I wasn't imagining I was starting a new organization. I felt like I was issuing a statement of Jewish clergy to call Jews into the ceasefire movement and remind them of our spiritual and ethical tradition and what it demands of us now. But of course, I was naive, right, about how that this was just going to be a statement and an intervention. And so what has happened since then is that that statement has continued to get signatories and signatories. We're almost at 370 rabbis for ceasefire now. And these are rabbis who have come, from different political affiliations and organizations. And that the fact that there weren't other organizations who were, where people who were coming, maybe, let's say, from the liberal Zionist perspective, that there were a lot of liberal Zionist organizations that were really pro and continue to be, right, kind of pro-war, right? And were very reluctant to call for a ceasefire, even though they knew very well to take at face value what Israeli members of parliament were saying about what their intentions were in Gaza. And so I've been in a position this year to organize and keep together a coalition of rabbis who, even when the stakes were kind of the highest, right, were coming out to stand against the status quo of blind support for Israel, right or wrong, right? And that this was a moment where they couldn't sit idly by, and they understood, right, that this is the ethical stand to take in this time. And so I've been challenged, right, because I came from Jewish Voice for Peace, right, where there was a sense of political unity, right? And that wasn't always true. Like, we progressed, and that's what kind of the book details of how we shifted as an organization. But ultimately, it was in like a set of political commitments, right, that everybody was kind of aligned with. And this was a new opportunity and challenge for me as an organizer to be working with this coalition of rabbis where we have a focus, like it's like a kind of a classic coalition situation, right? Where everybody's coming together because there's one thing that we really agree about, but there's all kinds of other issues that we don't, right? Or we don't know yet if we agree because we're not talking about it yet because we're narrowly focused on ceasefire. And, I think it's been a really interesting journey for me to kind of understand that even when the urgency to protect life and to stop this mass murder and on, what, the International Court of Justice, right, has deemed a probable genocide, that we also at the same time have to understand that this is a long-term struggle and that there is an important role for rabbis to play in ensuring that Judaism, and gets to the question we were talking about before about like saving the soul of Judaism, that Judaism continues to be a source for liberation, right? And that continues to be a source for people to scaffold their lives, to take ethical action, and that there's the moral power that rabbis bring. So it's been kind of confirming for me of all like the different instincts I know as an organizer, and challenging for me in this time to understand that I have, this obligation, right, to ensure that the work that we're doing is building and is ensuring that we're not just thinking in the immediate term, but thinking a little bit further out, and laying the groundwork for the true kind of like overhaul and transformation, right? And because this has created a rupture in American Jewish life, and that we can stand prepared to take the full political and communal advantage of this moment.
That was really beautifully put, Alissa, thank you. I think on the note of responding to a specific moment, I'm going to ask a more depressing question, which is that a lot of this book, deals with your experiences of leading JVP from the first Trump administration, including gathering together for a night of mourning the first time he was inaugurated, and the fear of the neo-Nazi activity that followed, for example, at Charlottesville. Obviously, his return and his relationship with Netanyahu has implications for people living in Palestine and Israel. And obviously, we don't have to pretend that the situation that developed under the Biden administration wasn't what it was and didn't have to have all the necessary criticism at the same time. But on the domestic front, I'm wondering, what are the implications of the incoming Trump administration for all organizers and for this movement specifically?
I'm spending, that was very depressing, you're right. I'm spending a lot of time thinking about this because I'm doing a lot of work right now and organizing within philanthropy to support Palestinian freedom. And one of the things that's happening, and I should note that it's already been happening under the Biden administration, and which is like repression both against funders and organizations that support Palestinian freedom. And there's like a very clear sort of like in quotes ecosystem, like an ecosystem analysis of what has contributed to the growth of the Palestinian liberation movement and support for it in the United States. And that includes targeting funders. And so even during the Biden administration and long before, there's been anti-BDS legislation passed in dozens of states. There's been attempts to codify anti-Semitism in the IHRA definition, which I know is a huge thing in the UK also, which basically defines anti-Semitism as including many different kinds of critique of Israel. There is, and then and other ways that there is an attempt to repress the growth of the Palestinian rights movement and to sort of anticipate it getting strong enough to change policy, but it has not up until now. And so sort of, the opposition is really thinking in a long-term way, in a way that in some ways we haven't had the luxury of doing, and have started to build this sort of like these sort of ramparts against the possibility of policy change. I will say that just this week, a bill that was already introduced in Congress, but now has been fast-tracked, and they're trying to pass it before Trump comes into office, would make it possible to strip any organization of its 501c3 status with almost no recourse. So that really would just sort of completely undermine the ability of the Palestinian rights organizations to do their work. And it's definitely very specifically geared towards Palestinian rights organizations. There you can sort of trace that back. But I think it's also important to note that it's also being used as sort of the canary in the coal mine, or the sort of, they're going after the Palestine movement, which is one of the movements that has the least sort of mainstream support. It can also be used against reproductive justice organizations. It can be used against climate justice organizations. You know what I mean? All the ways, in the same ways that anti-BDS legislation has specifically, like, the actual language of anti-BDS legislation has been like picked up and turned into like anti-climate justice work. That's happening. And so in a lot of ways, it's obviously very concerning in its own in its own right, but it's even more concerning in some ways when you think about it, the ways that it's going to be used to sort of try to draw wedges and break the left. So I think, there's tons of conversations happening now between that, and that will continue to happen, I think, between now and the inauguration, that are going to be a lot about movement defense work, how to fight against repression, the assumption that some groups are going to lose their 501c3, which is like, that's the tax term for nonprofit organization, for folks who don't know that. The potential freezing of bank accounts. I don't know if folks have seen Project Esther, which is this like really creepy and scary proposal that came out of the Heritage Foundation, which is the same organization that brought us Project 2025. And it sort of plays as Jewish, even though it's the Heritage Foundation, a bunch of Christian nationalist organizations who put it together. But, they sort of start talking about something they call the Hamas Support Network. It includes JVP, it includes SJP, it includes a lot of Palestinian organizations. And they're just talking very, very bluntly and affirmatively about the ways they are going to try to break the movement through RICO charges, which are charges that are usually used against organized crime, through many different methods that I'm sure will be have constitutional challenges. So they are very much preparing for this repression. And I will say they wouldn't have found such good footing if the current Congress and the current president hadn't also done a lot of this work for them. So, I don't think we can, in some ways, it's going to be much, much worse under Trump, but we can also put a lot at the feet of the Democrats who didn't push back strongly enough against this.
Thank you again. This has all been great. So we have a little time for questions. In the Q&A, we had one about BDS, which I think would be a good one to ask, considering we just talked about it for a little bit. So our questioner says, this is particularly relevant considering co-founder Omar Barghouti wrote the foreword for the book, and asked the following question. Can anyone talk about the BDS movement's expectations from Jewish/Israeli activists? It seems they don't give space for newly politicized Jewish/Israeli activists, or those just starting to move towards anti-Zionism, and that many of these projects and actions can be kind of lumped under the idea of normalization, which seems counterproductive from this end. Do you guys have any thoughts about that?
I do. I mean, I think this may not be what the questioner wants to hear, but actually our experience, and I mean, maybe it's not a surprise because Omar did write the foreword to our book, and there was a reason we asked him to write the foreword to the book, and that was that because he specifically, and the BNC, the Boycott National Committee specifically, were and continue to be one of JVP's key Palestinian allies. And it's very important, I think, as a Jewish organization to be rooted in accountability to Palestinian leadership. And the BDS call, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions call, is a real baseline within Palestinian civil society. It's the largest, it encompasses every kind of organization, from unions to Islamist organizations to agricultural workers to, it really has the vast majority of Palestinian civil society supports the BDS call. So as a Jewish organization, I think it's very important to peg ourselves to these calls from Palestinian civil society. But I'll also say, and we talk about this quite a lot in the book, is that we actually found that the BDS movement was incredibly patient with us, like incredibly patient. Like, I can't say enough about the ways that they were willing to work with us and let us learn at our own pace. And they never stopped pushing us. But they also were incredibly I'll just say patient again with us, with the fact that we were in process, and they understood that we were going to need to go through whatever process we needed to in order to eventually come out fully supporting BDS, which we did in 2015. But up until that point, we continued to have like a very fruitful and productive relationship with them because they were that patient with us. And I think that and I think that it's important to, there are principles behind the boycott call. And so, yeah, you're being asked to make some choices, and there are some things that you have to, once I think the consequences of the BDS call, considering the scale of the atrocities that are being perpetrated against people in Gaza and now in the West Bank and Lebanon, and that has been true in an ongoing way for decades, the consequences that are imposed by the BDS movement are pretty minimal in comparison to the scope of the crimes that are being committed by Israel. And so it's not actually that big an ask. It's, sort of the minimum that solidarity would demand. But, and again, we were talking earlier about being uncomfortable. And so there's things that are uncomfortable about being asked to do that. And you have to figure out how to be in process to come to understand those. But those are, I think, very legitimate, demands to be asked of us. And so I think that, in general, our experience of the BDS movement has been that it's been one that was very fruitful to partner with. They were always extremely conscientious about fighting against anti-Semitism, many times put out statements against anti-Semitism. And I guess the one other thing I'll just say about that is that they also did have conditions on us when we weren't supporting the full call, which I think were very reasonable. And those were that we not undermine the BDS movement. So it was fine that we weren't supporting what was called the full call against Israel, like we started out by doing, and the campaigns that targeted the West Bank, essentially, and East Jerusalem, and settlements within them. And that was fine that we had these more limited campaigns, but it was very important to them that we not say like this kind of BDS campaign is kosher, but that kind isn't. And that, again, seemed very, very reasonable. And that was part of the building up of the deep partnership that has been so important in JVP's history.
Yeah, it's interesting. It makes me think, growing up in a Zionist kind of setting, you do develop this sense that every demand that's made is too much. It's kind of an automatic reaction that it's always extreme. Everything is extreme, and actually when you start to look at some of these demands, it's like it's not actually that heavy. The demands that are being made relative to the suffering that's happening, the alternative, which I think is really interesting. We have another question in the Q&A. Someone anonymous has asked this. How can the work of JVP translate into combating Christian Zionism? Do Jews have a role to play there, or will they have to come from within Christian communities themselves?
Thank you for that question. I think talking about Christian Zionism is really important. As Rebecca was just talking about Project Esther, that was put together by Christian nationalists and Christian Zionists. And I think for a long time now, Christian Zionists have actually gotten off the hook a little bit for their responsibility for the crimes that are happening on the ground in Israel, Palestine, and have been for so many decades. To answer your question, kind of directly, there is I'm very delighted to see it, a new organization that has emerged in the past year called Christians for a Free Palestine, that is here in the US, that is starting to organize explicitly to combat Christian Zionism and take responsibility for Christian communities. I think there's work in Christian communities to do akin to what JVP is doing in Jewish communities, right? There's theological anti-Semitism inside of Christianity that needs to be unlearned, and there's Christian Zionism inherent in a lot of Christianity that needs to be challenged, and that history needs to be kind of revealed, right? Because from my reading of history, and you all might know more given that a lot of this happened in the UK, right? That a lot of the members of British Parliament that were essential, especially Arthur Balfour in particular, were themselves Christian Zionists. A lot when Zionism was political Zionism was becoming a thing, right? In the late 19th century, it got a lot of backing from secular Jews and Christian Zionists, right, who wanted to see historic Palestine populated with Jews in order to hasten the second coming, when Jews then have to convert en masse or burn. Nothing is more anti-Semitic than that. And there's been this very cynical, you know, a collaboration between Jewish and Christian Zionists. The Jews say, and I know there's like members of my own family that support Christian Zionism, where I say, like, it's so, like, how could you possibly? And they're like, well, they're wrong about how the end times are going to work. And it's just, it's like a marriage of convenience, basically. But it's extremely dangerous. There's a film I want to recommend for people to watch that's you could watch for free on the internet called Till Kingdom Come. That's actually produced by some Israeli filmmakers about Christian Zionism in the US. And I'm not sure the current state of Christian Zionism in the UK. But I think to say that, like, I think my answer is I want to see Christian communities go and take responsibility for Christian Zionism the way that Jews are taking responsibility for Jewish Zionism. In the US today, and now that Trump has been reelected, Christian Zionism has long animated US foreign policy, right? And Netanyahu was the first to create a Christian Zionist coalition in the Likud in the 90s. And this is a long-standing kind of meeting of the worst minds, right? That is coming to like shape US foreign policy. And it's something that needs to be nipped at the bud. And we can, play our part, right, as Jews in kind of acknowledging that. But there's a lot more power and a lot more possibility, I think, for Christian communities to be taking that up themselves.
The historical element of that is really interesting there, especially as you brought up Balfour and all the connections in the UK. You guys did a great job on the historical elements in the book, particularly on highlighting how anti-Zionism has always existed within Jewish communities. And I think that thought will actually propel us really well into the last questions. So I'm going to stick two together and be a little sneaky and kind of package them as like a forward-looking question for you both. So one aspect of this, someone asked, what does a non-Zionist Israel look like? Like what could the future for Jews be post-Zionism, which I think ties nicely to the history bit. And then the other side of this is how are you both living with and tending to your grief, despair, and also hope at this moment?
Oh, those are nice questions. Do you want me to go first, Rebecca? You want to go first? The question about kind of what's next, I mean, that's what I heard in that question you were saying of like like what happens after Zionism. The answer for me is like, is honestly like a return to Judaism, right? Like my read of Jewish history and of Judaism, right, is that Judaism is a religion and a religious civilization that started in exile and in diaspora, right? Before the destruction of the Second Temple, we can talk about Israelite religion. But Judaism, as we practice it today, is a rabbinic tradition, right? It's informed by the biblical period and by the Torah, of course. Those are our foundational texts. But every facet of Jewish life was kind of imagined and created in diaspora and for diaspora. Like I see Judaism as a tradition made for diaspora. And I think my read of it is like Zionism is actually antithetical to it, right? That's kind of why we have ultra-Orthodox Jews who are anti-Zionist, right? They, read the same text. We all read the same text and understand that fundamentally that the obligation is to be in what is really a spiritual state of exile. That's all of us humans are in that, right? We are separate from the source. You know, it doesn't have to, you don't have to think about God if that's not part of the way that you relate to it. But there is just like a fundamental truth of the human condition, right? Of being separate. So I think that, to me, I feel like Zionism has really kind of hijacked kind of the core spiritual metaphors of Judaism, and that there are those of us who have been continuing to practice Judaism as that tradition, as a tradition of yearning for wholeness, of pursuing liberation, and throughout Jewish time and Jewish history, Jews have lived interdependently with other communities. We've also lived under the boot of communities, and there's many different experiences of Jews living with others throughout the world and throughout time. And I look forward to us figuring out a new way of kind of embodying the rituals and the holiday cycle, and ways of finding and building interdependent communities. And, you know, to me, that safeguarding of Judaism, as I understand it, is kind of my answer to the second part of that question, right? I'm in the phase of life of having elementary and middle school aged kids who are going to learning to be Jewish in a community that is led by anti-Zionists, and they are showing me in real time, right? They are getting a different thing than I got. I got Israel and the Holocaust as my education, and they're getting midrash, which is like interpretive tradition. Like they're like getting to engage with how to like make meaning from Jewish texts, and how to see themselves reflected in our ancestral stories, and innovating the holidays to make sense to them for who they are now, and living a thriving Jewish diasporic life. And that's kind of what's keeping me going right now as I prepare my one of my kids to become a Jewish adult in a few months, and seeing them embrace it in its complexity, but also its simplicity of being Jewish anti-Zionist next generation.
Love that, Alissa. Well, first on the question of like a non-Zionist future for Israel, I feel like that's actually a harder question than it used to be. I lived in Israel for 3 years, from 2006 to 2009. So, you know, I used to go to the protests in the village of Bilin sometimes with the Jewish anti-Zionists, the anarchists against the wall, and the Palestinians, and we'd go to the marches together against the wall on Fridays, and you know, get tear gassed, and every once in a while someone would get shot. It was, you know, it was an intense scene, but always afterwards there would be a meal together, and we'd all sit and we'd eat together. And you know, on more than one occasion, people would say like, this place could be so great. You know, like this place could really be so great. And I always hold on to that vision of the idea that it is possible to build a joint society. There's actually Zochrot, which is an Israeli organization, and Badil, which is a Palestinian refugee rights organization. They used to convene this conference every year or two that was about envisioning return. And they would bring like urban planners and architects and stuff together to talk about what return would actually look like. And that was also super inspiring. So it was like, yes, this is a society that could be built. We have the tools, and we have the ways of thinking creatively about it, and that sort of thing. You know, and I also think about it in terms of like, you know, is it possible for Israel to be non-Zionist? You know, even the word Israel is a fraught one in thinking about that. But I also think about the fight against apartheid in South Africa, and, you know, the idea that South Africa isn't South Africa without apartheid. You know, for people who feel like Israel can't be Israel without being Zionist, you know, it's really about a transformation into a different kind of society. And if people feel like there needs to be Jewish supremacy for the state to exist, then I would, you know, want them to examine what that means about what they are willing to live with in order to have that state. But all that being said, like the real truth is that I really don't know after this past year, like the level of decimation in Gaza and the like utter destruction of Palestinian life does make it kind of hard to think about build like what it would really look and feel like to build a society where people have, you know, can live equally, and whether Palestinians would have the would be willing to do that anytime soon. And by soon I mean like generationally soon. I just don't know, and I don't know that anybody knows. So I don't want to like say some platitude that I don't believe about it. I think that's like one of the biggest questions facing all of us now is to try to envision what a future looks like after, even though we're not after yet, but trying to envision a future after this devastation. And that does bring a lot of grief. So like, just to bring it to the end, you know, like I think that acknowledging the grief is really important. You know, I have some sort of like day-to-day things that are pretty quotidian, especially compared to what Alissa was saying, like, you know, walking with my dog and knitting, and Alissa and I talking on the phone when there's something we're really upset about, and, you know, all the kind of like daily things that you do. But I think that what I ultimately rely on, I'm still very active in my local JVP New York chapter, and we've been putting on like really, really, really incredible, powerful actions like the Grand Central Action, and we just did one at Wall Street recently. And, you know, I think there's a Grace Paley, who's a Jewish ancestor, you know, has this phrase that's the only recognizable feature of hope is action. And I really live by that. Like when I get, like, I notice if I haven't gone out into the streets and done something concrete for a few weeks, I start to get incredibly depressed and anxious. So I find that being involved in movement and being out in the streets with my comrades is what keeps me going.
That was such a great note to end on. Thank you so much to Rebecca and Rabbi Alissa for coming to speak with us today, and for all of the amazing work they've done for the Jewish left and the Palestine Solidarity Movement over the years. Everyone give them a virtual round of applause if you know how to function with Zoom. I certainly don't, but do it in your brain if you can't. And don't forget to use the code in our registration link for 40% off. I think Evan just sent it in the chat again, which is 40% off Solidarity is the Political Version of Love. It's such a fantastic book and a fantastic tool for our broader organizing work. So I highly recommend it.
Yeah, it's been just amazing to speak with the two of you, and really supplemented everything that I understood from the book to have you both kind of articulate it in person and expand on it and bring your personal experiences into it. It's been really strengthening. So I'm very grateful to you for both for being here. Alissa and Rebecca, for everyone else, are also speaking at an event in London with Ben Jamal of the PSC on the 30th of November. The link for that should also be in the chat. Representatives of McCann and War on Want will also be there at the same event. So yeah, if you're in London or able to get down to London, go along to that to hear more of the great thoughts that we've listened to this evening. Other than that, just left to say thank you to everybody for coming. Don't forget to subscribe to Vashti. We're a small worker co-op trying to make a difference to the Jewish media landscape and, you know, bring you more events like this and more thoughts like this. So we rely on our readers to be able to do that. So please subscribe, look at the website, and keep in touch for more events like this. Other than that, thank you again to Rebecca and Alissa and everyone watching, and good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.